Hi, so this is my talk on understanding the security of Zcash. My name's Daira Hopwood, Z here pronouns. And the slides are at this URL on GitHub, Daira/Zcash-security. I made sure those are up to date. Okay. So I couldn't do a talk in the US without expressing the solidarity with people affected by recent attacks on bodily autonomy, the repealing of Roe versus Wade. It's essential for bodily autonomy that we have privacy, that those rights are intertwined, and we have to have financial privacy to have privacy. Okay, so some goals of this talk. You already probably know that Zcash is based on the Zero Cash paper, and that paper had some security proofs of the version of the protocol described in the paper. But there are some limitations of those proofs. They only apply to the version of the protocol described there, which is quite different from Zcash in some ways. And those security definitions don't give the adversary enough power. So they don't give the adversary the power to do front-running attacks, which is where you see a legitimate user's transaction, and the adversary can get their transaction to the blockchain first, for example, and a number of other deficiencies which we'll go into later in the talk. And I definitely don't have time to go over sort of rigorous security proofs, and I don't have security proofs for some of the properties, but the idea here is to explain at a high level why we expect the protocol to be secure and what details need to be filled in to have a convincing security argument. And I'm only going to I'm mainly going to concentrate on Orchard. Obviously, all three shielded protocols and also the transparent protocol have to be secure to have balance. For privacy, the parts of the protocol that a user is actually using need to be secure to maintain the privacy. Okay. So there are a number of things that are out of scope. I'm going to assume that we have a blockchain with eventual ledger consistency. So I'm not going to talk about attacks on that layer, except that when we're analyzing the higher level protocols, we have to assume that there might be rollbacks, even if they're only short rollbacks. And I'm not going to talk about network level privacy. It's very important. We do sort of leak information via IP addresses and things like that. And there are things that we could do to mitigate that, but it's not in scope for this talk. And similarly, all of these other things, I'll especially call out if there's a security flaw in the transparent parts of the protocol, then that's going to affect these security properties as well. Okay. And the symbol, the sort of double exclamation mark, is something where I'm hand waving maybe slightly. Okay. So the shielded protocol has several versions, and I'm only going to concentrate on Sapling a little bit and Orchard. So why do we need strong privacy properties in cryptocurrency? Well, there are some very powerful attacks if you leak partial information about the transaction graph. So for example, if you have a cryptocurrency based on ring signatures where what you're doing is you have a ring of possible outputs that could correspond to each input, as in Monero, for example, then if you intersect that information that the adversary gets between several transactions, and especially if the adversary is a participant and do active attacks, and that leaks a lot of information. And plausible deniability is not enough, because so if there's enough information to put you under suspicion, then there are lots of ways in which that suspicion can be confirmed. Whether it's legal, so whether it's cops standing up at your door or fascists or both, then you're not in a good place. Okay. So we don't want to just do analysis in a single security model, because we care about the adversaries that have additional abilities. So, for example, suppose there's a flaw in the zero-knowledge proofs that allows some adversaries to break knowledge soundness. We would still want privacy to hold. And in the longer term, if it turns out that quantum computers are practical and they can break discrete logs, for example, then we want to be able to analyze the effect that that has on various security properties. And in particular, I'm going to discuss the effect that a quantum computer would have on privacy properties. Okay. Right, so how does Zcash work, basically? We start with a ledger that has eventual consensus. We have a structure of keys. So if we generate a spending key, then we can derive from that a full viewing key, and then from that an incoming viewing key, and then from that an address. So this is like a hierarchy of authority. The spending key gives you the most authority, and then the address the least. And each of these arrows are one way, and they're supposed to be collision resistant. So in other words, there's supposed to be only a single incoming viewing key, full viewing key, spending key for a given address. Okay, and we're not supposed to be able to go backwards in the derivation tree. So if I give you an address, you're not supposed to be able to get the other keys. So we use a UTXO style model. I'm going to assume that people know what that is. And the shielded value is held in notes, which are analogous to UTXOs. Each note has a value, so an amount in ZEC, or if we add ZSAs in some token, and an address. And then the intended property is that only the holder of the spending key for that address can spend it. The caveat here is, so whenever I say the spending key for an address, there technically could exist more than one, but because these arrows are collision resistant, there's only one that an adversary can actually find. And so how could an adversary compromise privacy in a UTXO-based cryptocurrency? So the main thing that they can do is gain information about links in the transfer graph. So that could be probabilistic information, as I was saying earlier about systems based on ring signatures. You already have, it's public, the information about which outputs could potentially correspond to certain inputs. So that's adversary information that the adversary gains. The adversary could get information about specific inputs or outputs of independent of the graph. Or they could get network metadata, so for example, the IP address of someone submitting a transaction. And the challenge that we have in building a private cryptocurrency is to hide these links in the transfer graph, but also prevent double spends. So that's the tension that we have that requires us to use zero-knowledge proofs. So to do that, this is an idea that goes back to a 1999 paper by Sandra and Tishmar called Auditable Anonymous Electronic Cash. I recommend that everyone read it because it's kind of the basis of Zero Cash and Zcash. So we have, for each note, we have a commitment and a nullifier. So when we create a note, we publish a commitment on the chain, and when we spend a note, we publish its nullifier on the chain. And then if a note only has one possible nullifier, and we check, so if we have this information in the clear, so we can check whether any nullifier is repeated and reject that transaction. Okay. So the other component that we need is some way for a receiver of funds to know which notes are being sent to it. So for each address, we have an incoming viewing key. So that's the key that the receiver uses to decrypt the incoming notes. Again, so in this case, there is exactly one incoming viewing key for a given address, but that's something that we need to prove as part of our security analysis. And then, so our outputs on chain, which consist of a note and a memo, they're public key encrypted to a key in the destination address. And then when, if I'm a receiver, I have to decrypt all of the outputs in the chain using my incoming viewing key, and if they decrypt successfully, then that was an output to me. So this requires that the encryption scheme be key private, so that if I have the ciphertext, I don't learn any information about which address it was encrypted to. Okay, so we're using the blockchain as an anonymous communication channel from senders to recipients. We don't actually have to send notes on chain. That's not enforced. But sending notes out of band is out of scope for this talk. Okay. I'm actually not going to, I'm going to skip this slide because I don't have much time and I want to concentrate on Orchard. So, a transaction, it has a number of, let's consider a fully shielded Orchard transaction. We have a sequence of action proofs, and each action, it spends a note and it creates a note. And then the proof doesn't directly check that it's balanced. So this is different from Sprout, where we had a join split, which is 2 in, 2 out, and we directly checked that each join split individually balanced. And that's not what we do in Sapling or Orchard. We use these homomorphic value commitments. And that's a commitment that you can add or subtract, basically. And when you add or subtract the commitments, you're adding or subtracting the value of the notes. Okay, so each action proof has one of these commitments to the input value minus the output value. And so if we add up all of the commitments to the in each action, let's for now ignore the facts that ignore the transparent protocol. They should all add up to 0. That's the 0 point on the curve. It's actually a little bit more complicated than that because we use this, it's called a binding signature. We also use it to prove that the creator of the transaction knew all of the randomness that's used in these value commitments. And that gives us a non-malleability property. Okay. So now I need to explain something called a fairy gold attack. So suppose that someone is sending notes to me. Can they create two different notes? I receive them, I validate them, I think that I've got both notes, but actually it turns out I can only spend one of them. That's an attack. It's an attack on spendability, and that we want to prevent. So let's see. Yeah, I'll skip over the thing about sort of efficiency in particular curves. Some other things that we add in NU5 are unified addresses and sort of various other cleanups over sapling that I'm not going to go into. So let's make a first try at sort of defining some necessary conditions for a protocol like this to be secure. So we need that you can only do the intended key derivations. So you only go from a spending key to a full viewing key to an incoming viewing key to an address. You can't go backwards. And for the other security properties to make sense, it has to be the case that it can't, for example, be two spending keys for a full viewing key, or sort of that this has to be a single chain of possible keys. You can actually have multiple addresses in sapling or orchard that correspond to the same viewing key, and that's mainly for efficiency reasons. Suppose you're an exchange, for example, you want to be able to scan the chain using a single key, but you have lots of customers, you can give them different addresses. So the other thing we need for this technique to be secure is that we have a note commitment tree, and we use the root of that tree in proofs to confirm that the note we're spending exists. And that note commitment tree has to be binding on the set of notes that have been created. We have to maintain this tree of committed notes, and the set of nullifiers, they have to be append only. And then we have to, when we're spending a note, we have to prove it exists, and we have to prove that we've revealed the correct nullifier for that note so that we don't double spend. As I said before, each note only has to have one nullifier. If it had more than one nullifier, then we could double spend. In each transaction, we have to make sure that the transaction balances. So it's generally possible in cryptocurrencies to destroy value. You just send it to an address for which no one knows the key. So the relevant security property here is that the total value of the output notes is no greater than that of the spent notes, because that would mean we were creating money. If we're supposed to be able to decrypt information using some of these viewing keys and get a consistent partial view of what's happened on the chain. So we have this view consistency property that the state of the blockchain that we're proving things about and the other security properties are consistent with what we get if we decrypt using a viewing key. And it's always possible that we can't decrypt because one of these ciphertexts was formed incorrectly, but any information that we do get has to be consistent. And then for privacy, when a note is spent, it's only a holder of the full viewing key that is able to tell that it's been spent. And so when I create a note and send it to someone, they can spend it at some later point in time, and even though I created the note, I shouldn't be able to tell when they spend it, unless I know the viewing key. And similarly, on the input side, on the receive side, I can only recognize outputs that are encrypted to me because I have the incoming viewing key and no one else can. Okay, so there's also this non-malleability property. So this is like non-malleability for encryption in that, let's say I'm given a ciphertext. I don't know the plain text, but I might be able to transform the ciphertext in some way so that when that's decrypted, it gives a related plain text. And that's something I shouldn't be able to do because the encryption is supposed to be hiding completely the plain text. And similarly, for a transaction, I shouldn't be able to transform one transaction into another unless I know all of the secret information that went into that transaction. So clearly, all of these are, well, maybe not clearly. All of these are necessary conditions, but they're a bit ad hoc. How do we know that this is sufficient? We don't. So we want to be a little bit more systematic. We want to do this by describing the capabilities of an adversary and defining properties that correspond to balance, view consistency, spendability, and so on. And if we do it that way, then we can be more confident that we have a complete characterization of the security of our protocol. This is, by the way, so I'm going to be using game-based definitions. There's a different way of analyzing security, which is to use ideal models. I personally think that game-based definitions are easy to understand. There's some trade-offs there, but that's the way of doing it. Okay. So informally, what are the properties that we want? Notice that we're being quite precise about the quantification of these properties. So this is, can the adversary construct a valid blockchain such that balance is violated, for example? So we need to be precise about that. Okay, so the properties are, we don't want to be able to create money. We don't want the adversary to be able to construct a blockchain where you decrypt something using a viewing key, and that's inconsistent with the effects of a transaction. And we need to be able to model the case where we have both an adversary and some honest parties that want some guarantees about what happens. So for balance, for example, we don't need to model honest parties. All we're interested in is, can an adversary create a blockchain where balance is violated? But in the case of spendability, so let's say I receive some money, I want to be able to spend it in future. I don't want an adversary to be able to interfere with that. But the issue here is that the adversary can potentially influence what I do. So they can't completely control what I do, but they might be able to do a social engineering attack. They might be able to tell me to do a transaction of a particular form. Perhaps they're a merchant and they're telling me to send money to them. And so we have to have a security model that can take that into account. And the more power that we give an adversary, the more confident we can be that we've covered all possible attacks. So here, we're going to assume that, so I'm the honest party who is a victim of the attack, potential victim of the attack. I hold my spending keys, but I'm going to give the adversary all of the possible information. Okay, so the only thing that the adversary doesn't know is my spending keys. They can tell me to do anything. Okay, and then the question is, am I still able to spend the money that I've received? And similarly for privacy, the adversary might be able to influence what I do. I'm going to analyze privacy in a slightly different way, just to look at components of a transaction that might potentially leak information. It's slightly less rigorous, but it can be made more rigorous. Okay, I'm going to skip over most of this. I'll just mention the diversified addresses. So I mentioned before that you can create multiple addresses that have a single incoming viewing key, and those are supposed to be unlinkable. So this is describing that unlinkability property. It should say unlinkability instead of linkability. Okay. So here, we can make a simplification. So if I know that balance holds for the blockchain, if I know that I can spend money that I've received, it follows that the adversary can't spend my money. Because if the adversary could spend my money, then I wouldn't be able to spend it, assuming that balance holds. Okay. So we can reduce the number of properties that we need to be able to prove in that way. Okay. So on the last slide, I assumed that it was unambiguous how to define the effects of a transaction. This is actually quite a difficult issue because we're using zero-knowledge proofs, because we're using the randomized commitments. So there could, for example, be multiple openings of a commitment. There could be potentially be so multiple states of the chain that are consistent with proofs. So I need to be able to define the effects of a transaction for the purpose of the security modeling. So if I say, for example, that the effects of a transaction are defined only by the nullifiers that I reveal and the commitments of the notes that I create, then that doesn't actually work. Because for the commitment scheme that we're actually using, it could be that there's any possible opening of the commitment. And that this is a consequence of the commitment being perfectly hiding. Okay, so if I can assume knowledge soundness of the proofs, then I can say that there's only one set of witnesses that could have been the input to a proof, and I can use those witnesses to define the effects of my transaction. And this works for the security properties that we want to hold under the assumption of knowledge soundness. So it doesn't actually work for privacy because we want to be able to analyze privacy, for example, for a quantum adversary. And a quantum adversary can break the proof system. Even a less powerful adversary might be able to break the proof system. So, well, we can use this for some of the security properties that we want to prove. So, balance, view consistency, and spendability, because we know that if you can break discrete log, then you can. There's no hope of gaining these security properties. Okay, so let's go into more detail. So like in the original zero cache paper security definitions, we have this oracle that's representing what is done to the blockchain, but that hides certain information from the adversary. So for example, in the definition we had before of spendability, we want to hide the victim's spending keys from the adversary because it would be trivially insecure if the adversary had those keys. So what we do is we define this oracle, and it can create handles for things that the adversary shouldn't be able to know. So the adversary can ask us to create an account for a potential victim, but it doesn't know the keys to that account. But it can refer to the account in other calls. So we call it an account handle. And similarly, it can, so you can go through these. It can derive an address for the account handle. It can ask us to create an honest transaction. So it can tell us what transaction to create, but it doesn't know the witnesses that were used to create that transaction. And notice that it can give us an arbitrary chain that it wants us to create an honest transaction in the context of that chain. So this can be used to model rollback attacks, for example. It also models front running. Okay. We also want it to be able to create its own raw transaction. So for the keys that it knows directly, it can create a raw transaction, submit that to the chain. But to model the knowledge soundness of the proof system, it's going to tell the oracle what the witnesses are for that transaction. Because it wouldn't have been able to create proofs if it didn't know the witnesses by knowledge soundness. And then, yeah, there's some technical details here. We define a valid chain, so just quite a low level. We give, for each block, we have sort of a header and sort of handles for all of the transactions in the block. So this corresponds to what's called an annotated ledger in the Zcash paper. So it's a ledger or a blockchain state that is all of the transactions are annotated with the witnesses. So we can use that to define the effects of the transactions. Okay. And the adversary will not know the witnesses for the honest transactions. Okay. So notice a difference in style with, if anyone is familiar with the security definitions in the Zcash paper, we have this decentralized oracle, but in the Zcash paper, it has these imperative operations that can be used to construct chains. That's actually really difficult to be able to look at the security definitions and tell that they're correct, because you have to reason about two potential chains that have matching operations. It's all a bit complicated to see whether you're actually defining the security definitions that you intended to. Okay. But for a particular security game, we can say that the adversary isn't allowed to use some of these operations. And we can add more operations that reveal partial information to the adversary. Okay. So I've already gone through the fact that this can't prove security against knowledge soundness breaking adversaries. Okay, but that turns out to be fine because we can analyze privacy separately. Okay. So I said that we have this blockchain where each transaction is annotated with its witnesses, so the private inputs to the zero-knowledge proofs. And so the witnesses to sort of the spend side of an action or a spend proof, they define which notes we're spending. The output side specifies which notes we're creating. Okay, we can define balance in terms of that, and that should be relatively easy, right? No, absolutely not easy. Okay, so can you read all of the text in the slide? I know it's very dense. Yeah, okay. Apparently people can read all of this text. Let's simplify things by defining a linearization of transactions in a chain. So for Zcash, it's relatively easy because transactions are ordered within a block. Blocks are ordered. Okay. So let's define some functions here. At each state of the blockchain, we have a set of notes that have been created before that index in the linearized sequence of transactions. And then, so this is a set. We have to prove that it's a set. We have to consider notes that are positioned. So positioned means that we know the index of the note in the note commitment tree. And then we have to define the multiset, so potentially with duplicates, of the non-zero valued notes. They have to be non-zero valued in order to account properly for dummy notes that have appeared in spends before that index. And then we also want to model issuance. Even if we're considering only the shielded protocol, we're ignoring transparent, we still need to model issuance to define balance correctly. So we define the issuance for Coinbase transactions. So the issuance of a Coinbase transaction is just the amount of money that's created in that transaction, and it's 0 for all other transactions. Okay, and then the pool balance is the total value of notes that have been created minus the total value of non-zero value notes that have been spent. So notice that it doesn't matter whether we're saying non-zero valued notes or all notes, because the total value of zero value notes is 0. Okay. So we can now define the security game, and so it's only necessary to give the adversary create raw transaction as an ability, because there are no honest parties involved. We just want to know whether the adversary could create a balance violating blockchain if it controlled everything. Okay, so that gives us the strongest possible security property. And for balance to be violated, then the chain must contain a transaction at a given index such that, okay, so the most obvious property here is that the pool value balance at the next index must not exceed the pool value balance at this index plus the issuance. It's kind of obvious why that would be the case. The other thing is we need to check that we are only spending notes that have been committed. So it might not be obvious why this is necessary, but the reason why it's necessary is it simplifies specifying other security properties. So we're not just specifying the minimal definition for money not to be created. We're also we're checking that our intuition about why money is not created is correct for this model that depends on commitments and nullifiers. And then, so an interesting thing that we need to make sure is, suppose that I've received a note. So let's say, for example, that I'm an adversary and I want to convince an exchange to give me money. So I've done a forgery. I send something to an exchange. I want them to give me money. All I need to be able to do is convince the exchange that it has a valid note. Even if all of the witnesses are correct, if I convince the exchange, then they will give me some fiat money and I've violated balance. Okay. All right. And there's some details here because we actually have 2 receive functions for incoming viewing keys and for full viewing keys, but they work in very similar ways. So, yep, that's pretty much it. You will have to go over these slides and look at the detail because I'm not going to be able to describe everything. Okay. So our security argument for balance is that, let's see. So we're not going to have to prove that the set of witnesses in our outputs corresponds to the things that we commit to in the note commitment tree. And similarly, we're going to need to prove that the witnesses in the spends correspond to the multi-set of notes where we've revealed nullifiers. So, and there's a caveat here for zero-value notes because of dummies. Okay. So a dummy note might not have been in the note commitment tree. So we don't want the security definition to include something that we can't actually prove for the real protocol. But it's harmless because it's zero-valued. So let's see. How much time have I got? Sorry? 20 minutes. Yes, I can do this. Okay. So to prove that we're only spending notes that have been committed, we need to show that the nullifier is computed correctly. So the opening of the commitment for the note that we're spending, that includes the value and the address. So you have to be able to go back from the address to an incoming viewing key and to a full viewing key. Full viewing key contains an NK, which is used to compute the nullifier. We need to make sure that that chain is correct. It happens for the particular protocols, and that the detail is different between Sapling and Orchard, that there exists only one IVK for a given address. We've done that part. And it's, if you look in the protocol spec, it explains why. And then the IVK for Orchard is the output of this commitment scheme, commit IVK, with input the full viewing key. And because that commitment scheme is binding, we know that there's only one opening of that commitment. The opening contains AK, NK, RIVK. NK is what we need here. So we know that's correct for a given address. And then the nullifier is computed deterministically from NK and other fields of the notes that are in the note commitment opening. So we should be able to prove that there only exists one nullifier and it's computed correctly. Okay. And then we also need to check that the spent note has a Merkle path to the root of the commitment tree. And it turns out that if we prove these things, then we can show the security property here about non-zero spends being a subset of outputs. Okay. And then showing that the pool value balance, sorry, that should say less than or equal to. You would think they'll get that comparison the right way around. We want to show that the pool value balance doesn't increase. Okay. And then, so that's already covered in those sections of the protocol spec, basically. You have to do some reasoning about the binding signature, because that's used to check balance. And then you need to show this property about received notes. And the argument there is that when you receive a note, you check its commitment. And then by the binding property of net commit orchard, that must match the output that was witnessed for the proof. Okay. And yeah, So I should have gone to this slide when I was doing that explanation, because it goes through the argument in more detail. I can just skip this and you can check it. It all makes sense later. Okay. And same thing for sapling, but I'm going to skip that as well. Right, so spendability. If I've received some notes, I've checked that they're valid, and then nothing else happens to cause those notes to be spent, I should be able to spend them. Okay, so this is a nice property for a cryptocurrency to have. So how do we define this? It's kind of complicated because we need to allow the adversary to create a chain to set up the attack. Okay, so an adversary has a lot of power here to set up the chain. It can create accounts. It can tell me to drive addresses. It can tell me to generate honest transactions. It can submit its own transactions. It can get the encoded form of any transaction. It can ask me to reveal my viewing keys, so either incoming or full viewing key. So it can do all these things. The only thing it doesn't really have is my spending keys. Okay? So then the adversary picks some subset of the notes that I created and is going to try to spend those. So it can, this would be non-empty subset, I've just noticed. It's fine for the adversary to pick an empty subset of my notes to spend. Okay, so it's going to ask me to create an honest transaction that corresponds to the spend that I should be able to do. So we're giving the adversary the power to choose what spend it wants me to do, that I should be able to do. Okay, to increase the strength of the security definition. Okay, so it can tell me to spend these notes to anywhere it likes. And then it has to find a ledger state extending this state called chain, which is what it set up originally. Okay, and it has to be able to prevent that honest transaction from succeeding in this new state. And the restriction is that in the meantime, it hasn't asked me to spend those notes. If it asks me to spend those notes twice, then there'll be a double spend and the transaction won't go through. And the attacker also succeeds if it causes my transaction to be invalid, or if it causes the transaction to do something other than what it was supposed to do. Okay, and we also need to make sure that when I receive a note, then sort of by definition of spendability, the note is still spendable until it's spent. The technical condition. Okay. So this spendability definition extends, it strengthens the completeness definition in the Zcash paper. So that the definition in that paper said that the honest transaction has to be mined immediately. It doesn't model the case where the adversary sees the transaction and can insert something in the chain before it. Sort of other sort of limitations with that definition that made it miss the possibility of fairy gold attacks. So the Zcash is vulnerable to fairy gold attacks. There's a relatively easy fix, but the security definitions in the paper held despite that attack. So this spendability definition sort of captures that kind of attack. Okay, and then we can argue why this holds. And so the main thing that we need to show is that the honest transaction that should succeed only depends on things that the adversary can't change. Okay, the caveat here about expiry height. So the transaction only needs to succeed if it's before the expiry height. Okay. And so we need to prove that two different notes, so two notes with the same commitment, can't have the same nullifier, because that would allow the fairy gold attack that I described earlier. So the attacker prepares two notes, they have the same nullifier, sends them both to me, I can only spend one of them. So we can go through why that is the case, so I'll skip the detail. And yeah, the detailed argument of why this holds is different from between sapling and orchard. Okay. So the next property that we want is view consistency. I just ran out of time to analyze this because obviously the core team has been very busy trying to improve the performance of Zcash. Okay. So we kind of glossed over this issue of key separations. It turns out this is critical for privacy against a quantum adversary. So we need to show that these separations, this one-way property from a full viewing key, this AK and KR over K, to an incoming view key to an address, that holds even for a quantum adversary. Okay, so yeah, we can go through the detail here. So here, if you have an incoming viewing key, it has a diversifier key that you use to encrypt an index to get the diversifier. And that encryption is done with FF1 AES, which is quantum, can be assumed probably to be quantum secure. When you go back from IVK to a full viewing key, you shouldn't be able to find a full viewing key given only an IVK. And that depends on the commitment scheme, commit IVK. And the details they'll be on the next slide. Then you have to show that there's sufficient entropy in each key. So if each key was in a small subset, then it wouldn't matter that it's technically one way, because an adversary could just search for this low entropy key, and that would break the protocol. Okay. So here's more detail about this. Suppose we're given DK, IVK, and OVK. So these are supposed to give less authority than the full viewing key. So we need to show that if we have all of these, then we can't get back to the full viewing key, even for a quantum adversary. This turns out to be a little bit complicated because so IVK is derived using commit IVK, which is a perfectly hiding commitment scheme. So if that were the only thing that we were deriving, then the proof will be obvious. But if we have DK and OVK as well, then they're derived also from the full viewing key using Blake 2B 512. And so we have to do this more complicated argument, basically because we've reused this RIVK key. So naively, you're not supposed to reuse a key for a perfectly binding commitment scheme for some of the derivation. But there is a good reason for us doing that, because we want to make sure that there's only one DK OVK for a given full VN key. If you compare this with the similar key derivation diagram for sapling, then OVK is separate. So that weakens the view consistency properties. So Orchard has stronger view consistency properties, but it requires a more complicated analysis for quantum security of going back from the incoming view key to the full view key. It turns out to be fine. And again, we need AK, NK, RIVK. For this to be reasonable, we need those to be high entropy. And we can do the analysis twice, once for quantum and once for classical. Okay. Going back, on the other hand, going back from an address to an IVK, so a discrete log-breaking adversary can just do that. But it turns out that privacy doesn't depend on that. But the other properties do, so we still need to prove that classically. Okay. And then there's some other details about, in practice, we use Zip32, which is a hierarchical derivation scheme for keys, similar to BIP32, and we need to prove things about that, because otherwise, that's necessary to prove the entropy of spending keys, for example. And we don't want to be able to go from a child key in the Zip32 hierarchy to its parent or to a sibling. I'm going to skip that. And similarly, we need to do an analysis that each of these keys have high entropy. Again, I'm going to skip the detail. Okay, so let's go. We proved all these things about key derivations and key separation. Let's go on to privacy. So first, we need to describe the things that we definitely leak. So the approach here is be explicit about the information that's leaked by the protocol, prove that those are the only things that are leaked by the protocol, and then you can do a higher level analysis. You can say, are these things that we leak reasonable? So that gives you it doesn't overclaim. So if you look at the definition of ledger indistinguishability in the Zero Cash paper, you get the impression that, that this is kind of perfect privacy in some sense, because it's totally indistinguishable between two blockchains. But in fact, if you look at the details of that definition, what it's trying to do is characterize what information is leaked, and show that the ideal model, the ideal world that still leaks that information is indistinguishable from the real world. It's simpler to just explicitly list the things that are leaked. And that produces a less complicated sort of security statement. It's more intuitive what the limitations are. Okay, so the things that we leak are transaction version, locked out. So these are kind of things that are sent in the clear in transactions. So they might be used as distinguishers. So different wallets that are different versions might produce distinguishable transactions. Or if they use features that are inherited from Bitcoin and we haven't tried to make them private. You leak the expiry height, so the block height at which a transaction is going to expire. You leak the anchor position. So when you create a shielded transaction, you have to specify a point in time in the commitment tree that your notes are relative to. So you'll be spending only things from before that anchor. And so you leak where the anchor is. So ideally, the anchor should just be a few blocks back. So that's not very much information that you're leaking. Then, okay, obviously, transparent inputs and outputs are leaked. Public value balance, so that includes, for example, the amount that you're transferring between shielded pools. You're leaking the fee, which we try to make only dependent on other data that is necessarily leaked. So this is why we prefer to have fixed fees. But if we change the fee policy, we would try to maintain this property that we're not leaking any extra information via the fee. You leak the number of join split spends, outputs, and actions. So this is very difficult to hide because if you want a transaction to be able to do an arbitrary number of transfers, then you kind of have to leak this information. You can pad, if you have a small number of actions, say, you can pad it to a minimum number. And I think we currently pad it to 2 actions, but it's still information that's leaked. And there's this thing called a dusting attack, where an adversary sends you lots of small valued notes and tries to notice whether you're using an unusually high number of actions because you only have low valued notes. So that is feasible. There's a Twitter thread where Andrew Miller, I think, actually does this attack on someone and is able to identify the transaction. So we need to do a little bit better in trying to mitigate these attacks. It's possible to define a note management policy that minimizes this leakage. So we should definitely do that. If you try to, so let's say you try to spend some notes and the transaction doesn't go through for whatever reason, and then you try to spend the same notes again. They will have the same nullifiers, so those 2 transactions can be leaked, can be linked. Whether the transaction is Coinbase, well, it's fine to leak that. And so it's intentional that when you use shielded Coinbase, so you're a miner and you want to output the mining rewards to shielded outputs so that they can be spent privately. It's intentional that those outputs are transparent. Okay, and there are some flags for Orchard that we leak as well, but under normal circumstances, they would only depend on whether you have a Coinbase transaction. Okay, so this is all. Notice that this doesn't include things like leaks at the network layer. So, for example, the IP address of a transaction submitter. Can I have some water, please? So, is there any? Okay, right. Well, I'm basically done. Yeah. So the gist of this is to show that each of the other things involved in a transaction is indistinguishable from random. So that's what we do. And then, yep. Something about diversified address and linkability. And then the rest of the talk would have been about so the primitives, the cryptographic building blocks that we're using, and what their security levels are. So we give estimates of the bit security for all of the elliptic curves that we use, and the encryption primitives that we use, and so on. And this is just a note saying that actually the circuits that we're building are very complicated, so it could be the case that those circuits implementations have a bug. Okay, that's it. Questions?
All right, we're slightly over time, and there are 2 questions on Discord, so we'll continue the discussion on Discord.
Yes, I will answer those questions on Discord.